The restaurant was glowing softly under the golden lights, the kind of place where the music whispered and the cutlery shone like silver rain. It was one of those elegant places in New York City where people came not just to eat, but to feel special for an evening. Among the waiters moving swiftly between the tables was Emily Carter, a young woman with calm eyes and quiet grace. Her hair was tied neatly in a bun, her black uniform spotless, her shoes polished though slightly worn from long hours. To the customers, she was just another polite waitress who smiled, took orders, and disappeared into the kitchen with quiet efficiency, but inside her heart, Emily carried something no one in that room could see. A hidden world filled with melodies, dreams and memories she tried hard to keep buried. Every day she arrived early before the doors opened, to help set the tables and check that every glass sparkled under the lights. She moved with a kind of rhythm that came naturally to her, as if even the act of setting forks and plates followed a silent beat only she could hear. Sometimes, as she folded napkins, she would glance toward the corner where a shiny black piano stood, untouched for most of the day. It wasn't just an instrument to her, it was a reminder, a piece of her old life staring back at her like a long-lost friend. Emily had grown up in a small town in upstate New York. In a modest house filled with music, her father, a carpenter, loved to hum old jazz tunes while working, and her mother would sing softly while cooking. When Emily was 6, her parents discovered her gift. She could play songs she'd only heard once, her small fingers dancing across the keys as if guided by magic. Her parents saved every extra dollar to buy her a used upright piano. Scratched and old, but to Emily it was treasure. She spent hours playing after school, losing herself in the sounds, feeling like the world made sense only when her hands touched the keys. By the time she was 18, she had earned a partial scholarship to a music conservatory in the city. It was the happiest day of her life. She believed it was the start of everything she had dreamed of. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Just a few months into her studies, her father fell seriously ill. His medical bills piled up, and her mother couldn't keep up with the expenses alone. Emily made the hardest decision of her life. She left the conservatory and returned home, promising herself it would be temporary. She took small jobs, saved what she could, and watched as the piano in her old room gathered dust. When her father passed away 2 years later, she moved back to the city, not as a pianist, but as a waitress looking for work. In the restaurant, she became known as reliable, calm and kind. She never complained, never raised her voice, never arrived late. The manager trusted her more than anyone, and the other waiters often came to her for advice, yet no one really knew her story. They didn't know about the competitions she had once won, or the piece she had composed at 16 that her teacher said could have been played on any stage in the world. Emily never talked about it, maybe because it hurt too much, maybe because the world she lived in now didn't have space for dreams that couldn't pay the rent. Still, every once in a while, when the restaurant was quiet after closing, she would sit alone by the piano. Her fingers would hover over the keys, uncertain at first, then she'd play a few soft notes, careful not to be heard. It wasn't practice anymore. It was something closer to breathing, a secret way to remind herself she still existed. The music would echo faintly through the empty dining room, mingling with the smell of wine and candle wax. Those moments were hers alone, fragile and fleeting. When she played, her face softened, and for a few minutes she wasn't a tired waitress. She was Emily, the girl who once believed she could change the world through music. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars honked, lights flickered. People hurried home. Inside, Emily collected tips, cleared tables, smiled at customers, and thanked them for coming. It was a simple life, predictable and safe. But deep inside her chest was a quiet ache, a feeling that something important was waiting for her. Hidden just beyond the edge of the ordinary, she didn't know it yet. But the life she thought was small and invisible was about to take a turn. A single unexpected moment would bring her face to face with the thing she missed most, her music, and it would happen right there in that same restaurant, on a night that began just like any other. Emily had no idea that destiny sometimes hides in plain sight, behind a tray of drinks, a polite smile, and a dusty piano waiting for someone brave enough to play it again. Emily's days at the restaurant followed a quiet pattern, like notes repeating on a broken music sheet. She served tables, refilled glasses, smiled politely, and carried trays that felt heavier each night. But behind that calm face was a story no one around her really knew. It wasn't that she wanted to hide it. It was just that life had buried her music under layers of responsibility and silence. When she was a child, people used to call her the girl with music in her hands. Neighbors would gather on weekends just to hear her play on her little piano by the window. Her fingers would glide over the keys like water, and people would whisper that she was born to play. Even her school teachers said she had something rare, something you couldn't teach, only feel. Music had been her language, her home, her heart, but that gift, that golden part of her life, had slowly faded into memory. After her father's illness and her decision to drop out of music school, she promised herself she'd return one day. She just needed time, money, and a little luck. Years passed, but luck never came, and time slipped away quietly like sand through her fingers. So Emily worked, smiled, saved what she could, and told herself she was fine. But sometimes, when she walked past street musicians or heard a song from her old playlist, something inside her would tighten, like an invisible string being pulled too hard. The restaurant where she worked had a piano in the corner, black, polished, elegant, and almost decorative. It hadn't been played in months, maybe years. Sometimes a hired pianist came on weekends, but during weekdays it stood there, gathering a soft coat of dust. Every time Emily walked past it, she felt a strange pull, like the piano was whispering to her, reminding her of who she used to be. One afternoon during a quiet lunch shift, Emily was cleaning near the stage when a little boy wandered away from his family and pressed a few random keys. The sound was slightly out of tune, but to Emily it was beautiful. The boy laughed, pressing more keys, and Emily smiled without thinking. "Do you play?" he asked curiously. She shook her head. "Not anymore," she said softly. The boy frowned. "Why not?" "It's fun." For a moment, Emily didn't know what to say, then she just smiled again, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. Later that evening, when the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, she found herself standing near the piano again. The chairs were stacked, the tables cleaned, and the air was still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Her hand reached out and touched the smooth surface of the piano. It felt cold yet alive. She lifted the lid, pressed one key gently, and the note hung in the air. Lonely but perfect before she realized it. Her fingers began to move slowly, shyly, like they were remembering a language they hadn't spoken in years. The sound filled the empty restaurant, soft and pure, echoing off the walls like a secret. She played a melody she had written long ago, back when she was 16. It had no name, but it carried pieces of her. Her laughter, her pain, her memories. Each note seemed to reach into her heart and pull out something she thought she'd lost. She played with her eyes closed, lost between who she was and who she had become. When she finally stopped, there was a silence so deep it felt sacred. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it quickly and whispered, "I miss this." What Emily didn't know was that someone had heard her. Tom, the restaurant's dishwasher, had been cleaning up in the back. He walked out quietly, standing by the doorway listening, his mouth slightly open. He'd never heard her play before, and he couldn't believe the sound was coming from her hands. When she finished, he clapped softly. Emily jumped, startled. "Oh my God, Tom." "I didn't know anyone was still here," Tom grinned. "I didn't know you could do that," he said. She laughed nervously. "It's nothing. Just old habits." "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Emily, that was beautiful." She blushed, embarrassed but secretly warmed by the compliment. "Don't tell anyone," she said half-jokingly. "Why not?" he asked. "You should play for people." She shrugged. "People don't come here for me. They come for food and wine." Tom looked at her for a moment, then said quietly, "Maybe they'd come for both." He left her with that thought, and she stood there for a while, staring at the piano. That night as she walked home, the sound of her own music kept echoing in her mind. For the first time in years, she felt alive, like something inside her had been unlocked. Over the next few weeks, whenever she closed the restaurant, she found small excuses to linger. She'd straighten chairs, wipe tables slowly, and when everyone was gone, she'd sit at the piano again. At first, she played softly, scared someone might hear. Then, little by little, she played longer, louder, with confidence she thought she'd lost. It was like waking up after a long sleep. Her fingers remembered everything. The rhythm, the touch, the emotion. She didn't just play songs. She told stories. Stories of love, loss, and hope. The kind of stories only music could tell. Sometimes, when she looked up, She imagined an audience sitting in those empty chairs, applauding softly, smiling, listening, and though there was no applause, no spotlight, no stage, it didn't matter. In those quiet after hours, Emily found herself again. She was still a waitress, yes, but inside her, a pianist was slowly being reborn, and soon, fate would find a way to reveal her hidden talent to the world, in a way she could never have imagined. It was a Friday night that began like any other, yet it carried a quiet electricity in the air. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, lights glowing brighter than usual, and every table was set with fine silver and tall crystal glasses. Tonight wasn't just an ordinary dinner service, it was a private gala for an exclusive list of guests. The kind of crowd that ordered champagne without looking at the price and expected perfection in every detail. Emily arrived early, her hair neatly tied, her uniform pressed, though her shoes felt tighter from the long week. The staff moved quickly, adjusting candles, polishing cutlery, double-checking the menu. The restaurant manager, Mr. Davis, was pacing nervously, barking small orders. Check table 9's wine list. Make sure the bread's warm. No mistakes tonight. He had been waiting weeks for this event, a music industry gala celebrating an award-winning producer's retirement. The guests included famous singers, composers, and critics, the kind of people Emily used to dream of meeting. As she prepared the tables, she caught sight of the black grand piano in the corner. It looked shinier than usual, freshly dusted, and the lid was open as if waiting for someone to bring it to life. A pianist had been hired for the night, someone well known in the local jazz scene. Emily smiled faintly, wondering what kind of songs he'd play, and whether he'd feel that same thrill she once knew. By 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Expensive coats were handed to attendants, laughter and perfume filled the air, and the sound of clinking glasses echoed like soft music. Emily moved between tables gracefully, her calm voice blending into the background. Everything seemed perfect, until a sudden commotion broke the rhythm. The manager's phone buzzed and his expression changed instantly. He muttered something under his breath and hurried toward the staff area. Emily, balancing a tray of wine glasses, heard him whisper in frustration, "The pianist just canceled." "What?" one of the waiters asked. "Now?" "But the event starts in 10 minutes. He's sick. Apparently he can't make it," Mr. Davis said, rubbing his forehead. "I don't have a backup." The restaurant fell into a strange silence for a moment. Music was supposed to be the soul of the evening, and now there was none. Emily froze where she stood, her heart skipping. A tiny voice inside her whispered, "Say something," but fear quickly silenced it. She kept pouring wine, pretending she hadn't heard. But as she looked at the piano, its glossy surface reflecting the lights, something stirred deep within her. It was as if destiny itself was standing there, waiting for her to take one brave step. The guests began to settle in. Unaware of the chaos behind the scenes, Mr. Davis whispered frantically to one of the bartenders, "Maybe just play something from the speakers for now." The speakers crackled awkwardly as someone tried to connect a playlist. Emily felt her pulse quicken, her palms sweaty, and before she could stop herself, she heard her own voice, soft but clear. "Sir," she said, "I can play." The words hung in the air. Everyone nearby turned to look at her. Mr. Davis blinked, confused. "You?" Emily nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, I can play the piano. I've played before." He hesitated, eyeing her uniform. "Emily, this is not the time for experiments." "I understand," she said quickly. "But it's better than silence. I promise I won't let you down." The room seemed to shrink around them, filled with tension and disbelief. After a long pause, he sighed. "Fine, if you're sure, just keep it soft background music only." Emily nodded, trying to keep her hands from trembling. As she walked toward the piano, she could feel dozens of eyes following her. Some waiters whispered, some guests glanced curiously, wondering what was happening. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could almost hear it. She sat down slowly, her fingers hovering above the keys like old friends meeting after years apart. For a moment she hesitated. It had been so long since she'd played for anyone other than empty tables and chairs. She took a deep breath and pressed the first note. It was gentle, uncertain, but real. Then another and another until a melody began to form. A melody that didn't come from the sheet music, but from memory, from her soul. The chatter in the room softened as people turned toward the piano. At first they seemed surprised. A waitress playing instead of serving. But as the music grew richer, fuller, Their surprise turned into silence. Emily's hands moved effortlessly now, guided by feeling rather than thought. Each note carried a story, of dreams deferred, of hope reborn, of beauty hiding in the ordinary. The lights glimmered on her face as she played, and for the first time in years, she felt free. The room that had always felt like work now felt like home. The sound filled every corner, soft but powerful, like a secret finally spoken aloud. People leaned in, whispering to each other, some smiling, some simply staring in awe. Mr. Davis stood by the bar, frozen, his mouth slightly open. He had expected an awkward attempt at background music, but what he heard was something else entirely. Even the retired producer, the guest of honor, turned in his chair, watching her with quiet fascination. As the final note faded into the air, the silence that followed was heavy, almost reverent. Then slowly the room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite clapping, it was genuine, emotional, thunderous. Emily looked up, startled, her eyes wide, her cheeks flushed pink. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. She just smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." And in that instant, something changed. The waitress who had spent years hiding her gift had just reminded an entire room what true music felt like. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The night that had started in panic would become the night that changed everything. For Emily, for the crowd, and for the piano that had been waiting, patiently, silently, for her to come home to it. The applause still echoed faintly in Emily's mind long after that night. For days, the memory of the piano keys beneath her fingers kept replaying like a dream she didn't want to wake from. She went back to work the next morning, pretending nothing special had happened, but inside her, something had shifted. Like a small light that had been buried deep within her was finally glowing again. Her coworkers couldn't stop talking about it. "Emily, I didn't know you could play like that," one said. "Girl, you could have been famous," another whispered as they polished glasses together. Emily laughed softly, embarrassed. "It was nothing. I just didn't want the room to go quiet," but deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was her heart speaking after years of silence. Mr. Davis, the manager, had been strangely quiet about it. He wasn't a man who liked surprises, and certainly not ones that broke his perfect plans. But that night had turned out better than he ever imagined. A few of the guests had even complimented him on the surprise performance, assuming it was intentional. So he didn't scold her. He didn't praise her either. He just gave her a small nod when she came in the next day. And in his world, that was approval. A week later, the restaurant received another booking. Another private event. This time for an art exhibition dinner. There would be live music again. And a local pianist was supposed to perform. But 2 hours before the guests were to arrive, a storm rolled through the city. Traffic froze, trains stopped, and the pianist called in stuck miles away. Unable to make it, the manager looked at his phone, then looked up at the team. "Not again," he muttered under his breath, rubbing his temples. The memory of the last event flashed in everyone's minds, and then all eyes turned toward Emily. She froze, feeling their gazes like warm lights on her skin. She wasn't sure whether to step forward or stay silent. Her heart thudded in her chest, that same whisper inside her returning, and "Say something." "Sir," she began softly, "if you'd like, I can fill in again." The manager sighed. "Emily, are you sure? This is a smaller event, but they're important clients." She nodded. "It's okay, I'll do it." This time her voice carried more confidence. The first time had been instinct, a leap of faith, but this time she was choosing it consciously, bravely. As she took her seat at the piano, the familiar flutter of nerves returned. The rain outside tapped gently on the windows as if joining in rhythm. The restaurant lights were dimmer tonight, softer, more intimate. Emily's reflection shimmered faintly on the piano lid, and for a moment, she saw both versions of herself, the waitress and the musician, and she smiled, realizing they weren't two people anymore, but one. She began to play a soft piece, something melancholic yet comforting. It was a song she had written years ago, but never shared with anyone. Her fingers moved smoothly, her eyes half closed, as if she was painting with sound. The guests looked up from their conversations, drawn in by the calmness her music carried. Even the rain outside seemed to slow, like the world itself was listening. Halfway through her performance, one of the guests, a woman in her 50s wearing a deep red dress, leaned forward. She whispered something to her companion, both of them nodding with interest. They whispered again to Mr. Davis. who looked surprised and walked over to the piano after Emily finished her song. "Emily," he said, leaning slightly toward her. "This lady here is asking if you could play one of her favorite classics from Clair de Lune." Emily hesitated for only a second, then smiled gently. Of course, when she began. The room changed. The soft, dreamy notes floated like light over water. Her hands moved gracefully, every note carrying emotion. By the time she reached the final phrase, the entire room was silent. The woman in red had tears in her eyes, and when the song ended, she stood and clapped slowly. "Beautiful," she whispered. "Truly beautiful." After the dinner ended, Mr. Davis approached Emily quietly. He wasn't a man of many words, but even he couldn't hide his admiration now. "You did good again," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice filled with quiet joy. Then he added, "You know, the woman in red owns a small art gallery downtown. She said she might reach out to you for an event." Emily blinked in surprise. "Me? Really?" He nodded. "Seems like people liked what they heard." That night, as she walked home under the drizzle, her shoes splashing through puddles, she couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in years, she felt like the universe was nudging her forward, like maybe this was the beginning of something she had almost given up on. She thought about her father, about the promises she made to herself, about the piano that had once felt like a closed door. Now it felt open again, wide and welcoming. When she reached her tiny apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed and opened her old notebook. Inside were scribbles of melodies, lyrics, dreams, things she had written long ago. She ran her fingers over the faded ink and whispered, "Maybe it's time to start again." Her heart felt light, like a bird stretching its wings for the first time after a long winter. And though she didn't know where this path would lead, she was ready to follow it. She didn't know that her simple act of volunteering that night would soon change her life completely, that her courage, disguised as modesty, would draw attention from people she never expected to notice her. Sometimes life doesn't give grand introductions. It whispers quietly and waits for you to answer. And Emily had finally answered, not with words but with music. The kind of music that speaks for the soul when the voice is too shy to speak. The evening of the next big event arrived quietly, the air outside cool and clear, the sky painted in fading shades of orange and blue. Inside the restaurant, soft candlelight flickered on the tables, reflecting in the crystal glasses like tiny stars. Emily moved between the tables with her usual calm grace, but tonight felt different. She could sense something stirring in the air, something that made her heart beat a little faster. The event was another private dinner, smaller than the gala but just as elegant. A group of guests from the art world, known for their taste in beauty and sound. The piano in the corner gleamed under the soft lights, its surface polished to perfection. It seemed to wait for her, quietly calling her name. Mr. Davis had already told her, "Emily, if the mood feels right, you can play again." His voice had been casual, but his eyes carried a glimmer of pride. For the first time she felt trusted, not just as a waitress but as something more still. A whisper of doubt lingered inside her. What if tonight wasn't like before? What if she made a mistake? As the guests laughed and clinked glasses, she took a moment to breathe. She wiped her hands nervously on her apron, walked toward the piano and stood there for a few seconds. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the glossy lid, her black uniform blending with the shadows. She took a slow breath, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Then she sat down, and the world around her seemed to fade into silence. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The first note came out soft and uncertain, like a voice whispering after years of quiet. It floated into the air, delicate, fragile, but alive. She paused, then pressed another key, then another. Soon, the notes began to find each other, like old friends reunited. At first, she played cautiously, testing the rhythm, feeling her way through the melody. But something happened as she continued. The hesitation began to melt away. The music started to take control, leading her instead of being led. Her fingers danced, her eyes softened, and her breathing matched the rise and fall of the sound. It wasn't just a song she was playing, it was her story. Every note carried a memory, every chord held emotion. She remembered her father's smile, her mother's laughter, the long nights she spent practicing until her hands ached. She remembered the moment she gave it all up, the tears, the silence, and now, the rediscovery of everything she thought she had lost. The guests began to quiet down, their conversations fading into whispers. One by one, they turned their attention toward her. A woman near the front table lowered her glass and stared in disbelief. A man leaned forward, his expression softening. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to disturb the magic unfolding before them. Emily's music grew bolder, richer, full of heart. The melody rose and fell like waves, spilling emotion into every corner of the room. It was raw, honest, and alive. She wasn't playing for applause. She wasn't performing to impress. She was simply being, for the first time in years. She wasn't a waitress or a lost dreamer. She was an artist, whole and unafraid. Halfway through, she closed her eyes. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm. Her face calm, her heart open. The notes shimmered like light in water, spilling warmth through the room. Even the candles seemed to flicker in time with her playing, as if the whole world had found its heartbeat again. And then, just as the piece reached its peak, something incredible happened. The old piano, the one that had sat silent for so long, seemed to come alive beneath her hands. The sound grew deeper, more resonant, as if it too had been waiting for her all along. Each note filled the room with a richness that no one expected from such a modest instrument. It was as if the piano itself remembered her, remembered the joy and sadness they once shared. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was silent. The sound hung in the air like a sigh that refused to fade. Emily slowly lifted her hands off the keys, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run a long race. She looked up, nervous suddenly, afraid to see the reaction. And then one person began to clap, softly at first, then another and another, until the entire room was filled with applause. Warm, genuine, overwhelming. Emily blinked, stunned, her throat tightening with emotion. She smiled shyly, whispering a small thank you, though her voice was barely audible. The guests stood, some smiling, some wiping tears. In that moment, the world felt unreal, as if she had stepped into a dream she never dared to believe could come true. From the back of the room, a man in a gray suit watched her quietly. He didn't clap or speak, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes. He was a music producer, retired but still respected, and as Emily stepped away from the piano, still glowing with shy joy, he leaned toward Mr. Davis and whispered, "Who is she?" The manager smiled faintly. "She's one of my waitresses." The man raised an eyebrow. "Not for long," he said softly, almost to himself, as Emily returned to her duties. She couldn't stop smiling. She moved between tables with the same grace as before, but now something in her had changed. She didn't feel invisible anymore. She had found her courage, her sound, her place, and though she didn't know it yet, those first trembling notes she played that night would echo far beyond those restaurant walls. They would carry her toward a future she never imagined possible. A future written not in words, but in music, pure and true. The sound of the last note still lingered in the air like perfume, soft and unforgettable for a long moment. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had paused to listen. Then, like a gentle wave rising from the ocean, the applause grew, first from a few, then from all, until it filled the entire room. But the sound wasn't just applause. It was admiration, disbelief, and awe woven together. Emily sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the piano keys, her heart racing. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, the same fingers that only hours ago were carrying trays and polishing glasses. Now they had made strangers fall silent and cry without words. She looked around the room, her eyes wide, trying to understand what had just happened. The guests, men and women dressed in designer suits and glittering jewelry, were no longer just diners. They were an audience, spellbound, caught in the fragile magic she had unknowingly created. Some whispered softly to one another. Others wiped their eyes, and a few simply stared at her as if seeing something rare and pure. The air was thick with emotion, warm, trembling, alive. At the bar, one of the waiters leaned toward another and whispered, "Can you believe that's Emily?" The other shook his head slowly. "She's been here for years, man. And none of us knew." Even Mr. Davis, the manager who prided himself on knowing every detail, stood frozen near the counter, his usually stern face softened, his eyes following her with quiet astonishment. Emily stood up slowly, unsure whether to bow or just smile. Her cheeks flushed pink, her lips curved into a small nervous grin. I just wanted to help," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the fading applause. Her words made a few people smile, And that humble sentence somehow made her even more endearing. Then something unexpected happened. A man near the front, tall, gray-haired, with a sharp but kind face, rose from his seat. He clapped once more and said loudly, "Bravo," his voice deep and certain. The crowd followed his lead, the sound of clapping rising again, stronger this time. Emily recognized him from earlier. He was the guest of honor, the retired music producer. He walked closer, his expression serious but gentle. "That piece you played," he said, "it's yours, isn't it?" Emily blinked, startled. "Yes. I wrote it a long time ago," she admitted softly. He smiled. "I thought so. I remember hearing it online years ago. A small recording. No name, no credits, but unforgettable." Her eyes widened. She could barely believe what she was hearing. "That was you?" he asked, his voice low with amazement. "You're the girl who wrote that melody?" She nodded shyly. "Yes, I suppose so." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "The world is smaller than we think," he said, "and tonight, it just got a little more beautiful." The guests around them murmured in surprise, realizing they were witnessing something special. A discovery, a story unfolding before their eyes. Someone started recording quietly on their phone, wanting to capture this rare moment. A hidden talent being found. Emily didn't notice the cameras. Her mind was still spinning, her heart fluttering like a bird just learning to fly. The music producer turned to the audience and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've just heard something extraordinary tonight." The crowd responded with warm, enthusiastic applause once more, and Emily stood there overwhelmed but glowing, her eyes shimmering under the soft restaurant lights. After the event ended, guests came to speak with her one by one. Some asked where she had trained, others simply said thank you. A woman in a silver dress held her hand and said, "You reminded me of why I fell in love with music years ago." An older man with kind eyes said, "You didn't just play, you felt every note, and so did we." Each word felt like a gift, wrapping around her heart and reminding her that all those years of struggle hadn't been for nothing. Later, when the tables were empty and the candles had burned down to soft puddles of wax, Emily sat at the piano again. The restaurant was quiet now, but the air still vibrated with the energy of what had happened. Her co-workers gathered around, smiling, still talking about the night. Tom, the dishwasher who had once overheard her secret playing, grinned and said, "Told you, Emily, people would listen." She laughed softly, tears in her eyes. "You did," she whispered. "You really did?" Mr. Davis walked up to her, trying to hide his pride behind his usual serious tone. "Well, I suppose we'll have to start calling you Miss Music now," he said. Pretending to sound annoyed, everyone laughed and Emily smiled. "Only if I still get to serve the tables," she said. The manager shook his head. "Something tells me you won't be doing that much longer." That night, when she finally walked home, the city seemed different. The streetlights glowed brighter. The air felt lighter. Every sound felt like part of a larger song. She carried her worn shoes in one hand and her heart in the other. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving behind a reflection of stars in the puddles. Emily smiled as she stepped carefully between them, thinking how strange and beautiful life could be. She had spent years believing her dream was over. But maybe dreams don't die. Maybe they just wait. Quietly, patiently, until you're brave enough to reach for them again. And that night she had done just that, without planning, without fear. She had played from her soul and the world for a moment, had stopped to listen. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound of piano drifted from another building. Emily paused, listening, her smile growing wider. The city was full of music, but tonight it had also found her. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, one thing was certain. The girl who once hid behind an apron had now stepped into her destiny. Not with fame or spotlight, but with truth. Because when the crowd fell silent and the music took over, they didn't just hear notes, and they heard her heart, pure and real. And that was enough to change everything. The next morning, the world outside looked the same. But for Emily, everything felt different. The sky was brighter, the city noise softer. Even the smell of coffee from the small shop near her apartment seemed sweeter. She walked to work like she always did. Same street, same steps. But there was a quiet spark in her stride now. It wasn't pride, not yet. It was something gentler. The feeling that life had finally noticed her. When she entered the restaurant, her co-workers greeted her with smiles and laughter. "Good morning, superstar," one said. Bowing playfully, another added, "So when's the album dropping?" Emily laughed, her cheeks flushing. "You guys are being ridiculous." But she couldn't hide the small grin tugging at her lips. It was the first time in years she felt truly seen. Mr. Davis appeared from his office holding his phone, his usual frown replaced by something halfway between confusion and amazement. "Emily," he said, "did you know you're all over social media?" Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" He handed her the phone, showing a video that had been posted the night before. Her performance, captured from someone's table. The caption read, "The waitress who stole the night." Below it, hundreds of comments poured in, words like angelic, unreal, and "this gave me goosebumps." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through them. Some people had even written that they cried listening to her play. Others were asking who she was, what her name was, where they could hear more. She stared at the screen, overwhelmed, unable to speak. Tom, the dishwasher, peeked over her shoulder. "You're viral," he said with a grin. She laughed nervously. "Viral? That's not even possible," but it was, by noon. The video had crossed thousands of views, and by evening, a small local news outlet had already written a short article. The headline read, "Hidden Talent Discovered in Local Restaurant. Waitress Mesmerizes Guests with Emotional Piano Performance." As the day went on, more calls came to the restaurant. People asking if the pianist waitress would be performing again. Some wanted to make reservations just to hear her play. Mr. Davis finally sighed and said, "Well, Emily, looks like you're part of the entertainment now." Everyone laughed, but deep inside, Emily was both thrilled and terrified. That evening, the same retired music producer who had attended the gala walked in again. He wasn't on the guest list. He had come just to see her. When Emily saw him, she froze, unsure what to do. He smiled warmly. "Don't worry, I'm not here to scare you," he said. "I just wanted to tell you that you have something special, something the world rarely finds." She felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, sir. That means so much," she whispered. He continued, "I meant what I said that night, your composition. The one you played, I recognized it." She blinked. "You really did?" "Yes," he said. "I heard it online years ago. A rough recording, no name attached, just pure emotion. I uploaded it when I was younger," she admitted shyly. "I didn't think anyone ever noticed." "Well," he said with a small smile, "I did, and now the rest of the world will too." He handed her a small card. His name embossed in silver. "I'm retired," he said. "But I still know people, good people, who care about real talent, not just fame. Call me tomorrow. Let's see what we can do for you." Emily stared at the card, her hands trembling slightly. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something big, something she had dreamed of but never dared to believe would happen. That night after work, she walked home slower than usual, her mind spinning. Every sound, every light seemed sharper, clearer, as if the world had become more alive. She replayed the producer's words again and again in her head. "Something the world rarely finds," she smiled to herself, whispering, "Maybe it's not too late." At home, she sat by the small window of her apartment, the city lights twinkling like stars below. She placed the business card on the table, next to her old notebook filled with forgotten melodies. She flipped through the pages, seeing the songs she had written years ago. Some half-finished, some just fragments. It was like looking at pieces of her younger self. A girl who believed that music could change everything. And maybe, just maybe, she had been right. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the restaurant's social media account. Someone had tagged her in another post. This one from a well-known music blogger. The caption read, "Sometimes talent hides in plain sight. Meet Emily Carter, the waitress who reminded us what true music feels like." The post already had thousands of likes. Emily read the comments, her heart pounding. People were writing things like, "I felt this in my soul," and "Please tell me she's releasing music." She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or run. Her emotions swirled like the melody of a song she hadn't finished. Part of her still couldn't believe it. How one night, one brave moment could turn into all this. The next morning, her phone rang. It was the producer, Emily, he said warmly. "I've arranged for you to meet a friend of mine tomorrow, a small studio owner. He wants to hear you play." Her breath caught. "Me? In a studio?" He chuckled. "Yes, you. It's time the world hears you properly." After the call, she sat in silence, trying to take it all in. She thought about her father, about the long nights she played in secret, about how close she came to giving up, and how one single act of courage had brought her full circle. That night she sat by the piano again, alone in the restaurant after everyone left. The lights were low and the city outside hummed softly. She placed her fingers on the keys, whispering, "Thank you," as if the piano itself had led her here. Then she began to play, not for an audience, not for applause, but for herself. Each note was a promise, and that she would never hide her gift again. That she would keep playing, keep believing, keep becoming. Outside, the city glowed brighter than ever. And somewhere inside that light, Emily Carter, once a quiet waitress, was stepping into her own story, not as someone who was discovered by accident, but as someone who found the courage to be seen. The moment of recognition had come, and it was only the beginning of her new melody. Morning light streamed through Emily's window, spilling across her small apartment like golden paint. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the little business card that lay beside her coffee cup. The silver letters glimmered softly, her possible doorway to a new life. She ran her thumb over the raised ink, her heart beating faster. Today she would go to the studio. Today, she would take her first real step toward the dream she once buried. She got ready carefully, brushing her hair, choosing her simplest dress, one that made her feel confident but not flashy. Her hands shook as she tied her shoes. It felt like every moment of her life had been leading to this. Every note she had played, every tear she had cried, every table she had served, all of it had brought her here. To this beginning disguised as an ordinary day, when she arrived at the studio, the city noise faded behind her, replaced by quiet anticipation. The building wasn't huge or fancy, but it had a warmth to it. Posters of famous albums on the walls, instruments resting in corners, and the faint smell of old wood and music. The studio owner, a kind-looking man named Michael, greeted her with a smile. "So you're the waitress everyone's talking about," he said warmly. "Welcome, Emily," she blushed. "I guess that's me," she said softly. He laughed. "Come in. Let's see what you've got." Inside the recording room, a grand piano stood under a dim light, polished and waiting. Emily approached it slowly, almost reverently, her fingers brushing over the smooth keys. She sat down, taking a deep breath. Michael stood behind the glass window, giving her a thumbs up. "Play whatever feels right," he said, his voice gentle through the speakers. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back in her childhood home. She could hear her father humming, her mother cooking, the sound of laughter echoing down the hall. Then she began to play. The first notes came out soft and trembling, like the beginning of a sunrise, but soon the melody grew stronger, flowing from her hands like a story being told without words. The room filled with music that felt alive. It was a song she had written years ago, one that carried both pain and hope. Her fingers moved effortlessly, her body swaying with the rhythm. Michael watched from behind the glass, his expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. When she finished, there was silence. Then his voice came softly through the speaker. "That was breathtaking." Emily looked up, surprised. "Was it okay?" He smiled, shaking his head. "Okay?" "Emily, that was pure emotion. You don't play notes, you speak with them." Tears welled in her eyes. She hadn't expected such words. All she had ever wanted was to be heard, to make people feel. And now, someone who understood music was telling her that she had done exactly that. Over the next few weeks, Emily returned to the studio often. They recorded her original pieces, some old, some newly written. Each session felt like a small rebirth, like a chapter of her soul being captured in sound. Michael introduced her to other musicians, singers and writers. Some days were exhausting, but she never complained. She was finally living the life she had dreamed of, a life filled with melodies, passion, and purpose. Her story began to spread beyond the city. A news outlet picked it up. From waitress to pianist, the story of Emily Carter. People were moved not just by her talent, but by her courage. She received letters and messages from strangers all over the world. People saying her music reminded them to chase their own forgotten dreams. She read every message, her heart swelling with gratitude. One evening, she returned to the restaurant where it all began. It felt different now, quieter, smaller, yet deeply familiar. Mr. Davis greeted her with a rare smile. "Well, look who's back," he said. "Our star pianist." Emily laughed softly. "I missed this place." He nodded. "You'll always have a home here." She walked to the piano in the corner, the same one where everything had changed. Running her fingers across the keys, she whispered, "Thank you." The restaurant was empty now, but she played anyway, just a few soft notes, a simple melody of gratitude. As she played, Tom walked by smiling. "You know, I always knew you'd do something big," she laughed. "You said that when no one else did." He shrugged. "Sometimes you just know." After she finished, she stood up, looking around the quiet restaurant. The chairs, the tables, the soft glow of the lights. It all felt like part of a memory, a beautiful reminder of where she came from, and how even the smallest places can hold the beginnings of something extraordinary. Months later, Emily's first small album was released. It wasn't a massive production. No glitter, no fame-chasing glamour, just her piano, and the stories she carried in her heart. People loved it for its honesty, for the raw human beauty of it. Her music was now being played in cafes, radio stations, and even tiny bookstores. But fame wasn't what she cared about, and it was connection, the invisible thread that tied her heart to others through her music. One day, as she stood outside the studio after a long session, the sun began to set behind the skyline. She watched the light fade slowly, her hands tucked in her pockets, a gentle smile on her face. She thought about her father again, about how he once said, "When you find what you love, never stop playing." And she realized she never truly had stopped. She had just paused, waiting for the right moment to return. The right moment had come, not in a grand concert hall or under a spotlight, but in a restaurant on an ordinary night. When courage met opportunity that night, she didn't just play music, she played her truth. And the world listened now. Every time she sits at a piano, she remembers that feeling, that spark, that miracle of rediscovery. Emily Carter, the waitress who once hid her light, had become Emily Carter, the artist who helped others find theirs. And her story, like her music, would keep echoing, soft, endless, and full of hope.